There is a lighthouse no matter where. It was built no matter when. It stands on a wild and rocky coast and has been shaken by many a storm. It bears a red light, revolving at intervals of 35 seconds. Many a despairing heart has been cheered, and many a homesick soul made joyous, as the little red speck appeared in the horizon and told it that home was near, and the dangers of the voyage almost over. I've always been fascinated by lighthouses. One of the first Disney Channel original movies that I saw was The 13th Year, and it quickly became my favorite, not just because I'm obsessed with merpeople, but because it was filmed in my favorite LA lighthouse, the Point Fermin Lighthouse in San Pedro near the Port of Los Angeles. This city is quite literally the keystone of Los Angeles, the place that allowed the city to truly become what it is today. After all, to build a city in a land with very few trees, you had to import lumber. The ships carrying that lumber needed a harbor, and for ships to make it safely to shore along a rocky coast, you need, of course, a lighthouse. Point Fermin, the oldest lighthouse in Los Angeles, was built in 1874, 20 years after Phineas Banning, known as the father of the Los Angeles Harbor, petitioned for a lighthouse to be built. And LA needed a lighthouse badly. Throughout the 19th century, sailors would describe Los Angeles as isolated, dangerous, and unpredictable. The lighthouse's first keepers were unusual for the time. 2 women, the sisters Mary and Ella Smith. A lonely lighthouse being kept by 2 women made it an instant legend, a source of fascination for people all over the city. Point Fermin was described in a poem by Haven Charles Hurst in 1908. In high lands fitted for a fairy palace, a lighthouse stands instead. The 2 sisters didn't keep the lighthouse for too long, though. As everyone who ever kept a lighthouse knows, it could be a deeply lonely and isolating job. They left service in the 1880s. And also like any other lighthouse, including the other 2 LA lighthouses, Point Fermin is reportedly haunted. Some say that the spirit of its early keeper, Willie Austin, haunts these halls, mourning his lost wife after he died of a broken heart. Nearby Point Vicente Lighthouse has a similar story, where, after residents of the Palos Verdes Hill began moving in around the 50s, they reportedly saw the vision of a dancing woman whenever the light swung around towards the hill. This is, of course, not true. It was only an illusion created by the light itself mixed with the fog, and after a thick layer of opaque paint was added to the hill-facing part of the windows, the ghostly Lady of the Light was never seen again. There's a 3rd lighthouse in LA, Angel's Gate, the Harbor Lighthouse. But we'll get back to Angel's Gate in a bit. Don't worry, I won't just be talking about LA, even though I definitely could. And obviously I will be touching on the movie The Lighthouse. How could I not? Today I want to take you on a brief and non-exhaustive journey through the modern lighthouse history, and why lighthouses always seem to be haunted, and for that matter, why their keepers have a reputation for going mad. There's more to it than you'd think. And side note, please stay tuned to the end for a very big and very cool special announcement. But before we get into it, let's hear a word from today's sponsor, Atlas VPN. You've seen them on the channel before, and folks, they're back. It's Atlas VPN. These days, surfing the internet without a VPN is kind of like living in one of those nightmares where you go to school without pants on. Atlas VPN encrypts your data and hides your virtual location, so your device gets a new IP and DNS address. Internet traffic gets encrypted, sent off to the VPN server, and then decrypted and shipped off to its destination, keeping you safe and protected in whatever you're doing. So what else can you do with Atlas VPN? Well, you can stream at high speeds, protect an unlimited number of devices, block ads and malware, and of course, save money while online shopping, because then websites can't bump the prices based on your location, which was super helpful to me in the last month when I booked travel for a research trip. Also, Netflix, Amazon Prime, and Disney Plus all have geo-restrictions due to licensing rights. With Atlas VPN, you can bypass geo-restrictions and access your favorite content from across the world by simply changing your location to the country that has the content that you want to access. Atlas VPN works on any device and comes with a 30-day money-back guarantee, so you can try it out and see if you like it. Right now, Atlas VPN is running a huge discount. It means that you can get the 3-year subscription for just $1.39 a month with a 30-day money-back guarantee. Time is running out, so get your deal by by clicking the link in the video description below, and you can start exploring the internet knowing that your privacy is protected. Thank you to Atlas VPN for sponsoring this video, and now let's get back to learning about the spooky history of lighthouses. Let's take a trip back in time to around the era when lighthouses underwent a transformation that would change them forever. You might imagine that hundreds of years ago, a crew aboard a ship may be overjoyed to spot land after weeks or even months at sea. Sure they were, but they also would have been very nervous or even scared, because there's a good reason why most shipwrecks happened near land. Reaching shore was the most treacherous part of the journey. The coast could be filled with miles of invisible dangers, hidden rocks and reefs, and walls that could destroy a ship. And because rocky, shallow waters could reach out miles beyond shore, this meant that if you survived a shipwreck, you could be stranded too far from land to swim, or get caught in a riptide and drowned if you even tried. I got caught in a riptide once, and dude, they're no joke. Honestly, if you're in LA, just don't even go in the water. That shit's full of leaking DDT anyway. One particularly gruesome story that caused a media frenzy at the time was the wreck of the French frigate La Méduse in 1816. It ran aground off the bank of Arguin, and its captain, Vicomte Hugh de Roy de Chambéry, left some crew on board while 147 others went with him to try and reach land. They had to build a makeshift raft and tied it to one of the lifeboats that the captain was in. But not long into their journey, the people on that lifeboat began cutting the rope to the raft, yelling, "We abandon them," and the raft and its occupants were left alone at sea, while the lifeboats disappeared without them. The next several days, dozens of people died, either drowned in a storm or of thirst and exposure. And then came the murder, and later the cannibalism. 2 weeks later, 15 men were left alive and were rescued by a passing brig. La Méduse's raft of few survivors was later immortalized in this famous painting, The Raft of the Medusa by Theodore Géricault. Shipwreck stories were common in those days, and were often the topic of fiction such as Robinson Crusoe and the Swiss Family Robinson. 362 ships were recorded wrecked by Lloyds of London in 1816 alone, and over 100 French ships would disappear in just the English Channel every year. While lighthouses did exist then and have existed since ancient times, their light was not usually enough to be truly significant, nor were there nearly enough of them. This didn't change until around the same time as La Méduse's wreck and subsequent trial of its captain, when an engineer named Auguste Fresnel invented the very first Fresnel lens, which would finally transform lighthouses into towers of light powerful enough to truly banish the darkness. He realized that he could create a lens which reflected the totality of the light into one direction by separating the lens out into several concentric sections of prisms that bent the light rays into parallel lines. It was hugely successful, and the Fresnel lens would go on to be used for over a century in lighthouses all over the world until electric lights and solar power would eventually and inevitably take their place. And furthermore, radar and radio would cut down on the inherent need for lighthouses to save lives in general. But the Fresnel lens lives on in the public's imagination. You may remember the 2019 film The Lighthouse, directed by Robert Eggers, how the Fresnel lens in the lighthouse, kept by Thomas and Thomas, becomes a sort of keystone to their descent into madness. Its glimmering light makes them obsessed, possessed almost, by the lens itself. The lighthouse's story was heavily inspired by the myth of Prometheus, the ancient Greek tale in which a trickster climbs to Mount Olympus and steals the fire of the gods to create humanity. This enraged Zeus, who chained him to a rock and had him eaten by an eagle for all eternity. The Fresnel lens in the lighthouse openly represents both the fire of the gods, as well as all knowledge itself, supported by the fact that Thomas Wick, played by Willem Dafoe, represents the god of the ocean Proteus, who is the keeper of knowledge and shares none of it. While Thomas Wick was able to look into the light unharmed, the Fresnel lens opening to Thomas Howard, played by Robert Pattinson, ultimately ends in his death. While not cited as one of Eggers' inspirations, this part of the story actually has an uncanny connection to the true history role that the Fresnel lens had as a tool of warfare. During times of war, Fresnel lenses were often hidden or stolen, and their powerful lights began to become national security concerns. Sure, lights provided a safe guidance to trade ships and local sailors, but they could also be beacons for the enemy. By World War II, the US Navy had taken control of the lighthouse service. The Fresnel lens in Point Furman was actually removed after Pearl Harbor due to concerns about a Japanese attack on Los Angeles, and subsequently disappeared for decades until finally being relocated and returned home only fairly recently. During the war in Europe, Germany took control over the lighthouses in occupied territories, locking out their keepers. In 1943, the Germans filled French lighthouses with dynamite that was wired to go off if the Allied forces drew near. The Fresnel lens had proven to be both a savior of lives and an instrument of death. Light itself has long been a symbol of knowledge and enlightenment. Fire gives way to civilization, the sun gives us life, and the lighthouse is our guide to the shore. But what Thomas Howard saw in that light we'll never know. But it's most likely that it was the knowledge of the universe that no human is strong enough to handle. And much like the lighthouse's role in war, it both saved him and ended his life. A day in the life of a lighthouse keeper was pretty demanding. You had to get up at dawn, make repairs, clean, do chores, be constantly prepared to respond to shipwrecks or other emergencies, and of course, keep the light in shape and running. During a storm, the light would need to be on and lit for 24 hours a day, an extremely taxing task to operate, particularly before the Fresnel lens was invented. So life as a lighthouse keeper was not easy. You had to be a sort of jack of all trades, because odds are you were too isolated to get help if you needed it. Sometimes you had to cross miles of stone across water, or take a boat in, drive miles outside of the nearest town, or traverse a dangerous pathway along a cliffside, like the way to the Point Bonita lighthouse in the turn of the century, which fell into the ocean so many times that the lighthouse service hired Chinese laborers to pickaxe a 180-foot-long tunnel through the hill. Chinese laborers themselves are an often forgotten aspect of this history, on the west coast of the US in particular. Chinese laborers who did the backbreaking work of building these roads, railways, and so much more for extremely low pay and under terrible working conditions and treatment because people knew they had nowhere else to go. This was the era of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, when the US government banned the immigration of Chinese workers, building off of the Page Act of 1875, which outlawed the immigration of Chinese women specifically due to the belief that they were immoral. The Page Act was effectively used to prohibit the immigration of East Asian women at large, regardless of their nationality. Though many Chinese men were able to find ways around the act by becoming merchants, farmers, laundrymen, meaning they were able to bring some family over as part of their businesses, they were still subjected to horrible scrutiny at the border checkpoints, where they were made to undergo humiliating interrogations. One of my jobs last year was logging and organizing some of these border checkpoint files in Southern California, and oh my god, the questions were awful. Unfortunately, I no longer have access to them to read any to you, but trust me, it was bad. The Exclusion Act was only repealed in 1943 during World War II, and the cap on the number of Chinese immigrants allowed into the country wasn't removed until 1952, a whole century after the California Gold Rush brought in the first great wave of Chinese workers, so many of whom are forgotten to history. The perpetual cycle of who this country believes is good enough to live here continues on and on. On a similar note, African Americans played a huge role in the operation of the US lighthouses. Earlier on, enslaved people were on rare occasions brought in to act as assistants in the southern lighthouses, though usually they ended up doing most of the job. One of the early black keepers' assistants was Aaron Carter, who worked at Cape Florida Lighthouse in the 1830s, and several others worked as keepers of various Virginian lighthouses later on. The history of black lighthouse keepers goes back even farther outside of the US, such as the woefully undetailed accounts of a man in England named Thomas Mingo, who worked in the household of Sir William Batten in the mid-1600s. Upon Batten's death, according to his will, Mingo was appointed the keeper of the Harwich lighthouses and paid £20 per year, which in today's money is about $5,000. We don't know much about his life outside of this, but he was doing well enough by the 1680s to get married and continued to man the lighthouses. People like Thomas Mingo, who were either enslaved or in servitude to the upper class in England, were often treated very, very poorly and were typically seen as props or status symbols. When slavery was abolished in the US, the lighthouse service would begin hiring newly freed people to work at stations. By the turn of the century, there were a good number of black lighthouse keepers and even all-black lighthouse crews. The first black lighthouse keeper of the Cape Henry Lighthouse was Willis Augustus Hodges. He served there after the Civil War, during which he acted as a spy for the Union Army, and worked with abolitionist James Brown to bring enslaved people to freedom along the Underground Railroad. In 1848, he wrote an autobiography titled Free Man of Color, but it wasn't published until the 1890s. Hollywood? Hello? Get on this? And of course there was Venus Parker, the wife of lighthouse keeper William Parker. Venus manned the lighthouse after his tragic death. Parker's wife, Venus, was grief-stricken, but she also knew that she was the wife of a lighthouse keeper and knew that the light must be lit, and having worked with her husband, she knew what needed to be done. She instructed the others to take her husband's body to the mainland, and she would stay and tend to the lighthouse. After all, the lives of others depended on the light being on. Parker's widow, Venus, was appointed as his replacement. She continued to keep the lighthouse for a little more than a year when she resigned in March of 1912. Though not lighthouses, life-saving stations have a rich history here too. Richard Etheridge, appointed in 1880, was commander of the Pea Island Life-Saving Station in Rodanth, North Carolina, the first of these stations in the US to have an all-black crew. It would operate under a black crew for the next almost 70 years. Many lighthouse keepers lived on the lighthouse grounds with their families, who often did a lot of work assisting the keepers themselves, but some lighthouses were far too isolated for the families to live there, like Angels Gate Lighthouse. And isolation like that made it easy for stress and paranoia to get a grip on people. In 1913, head keeper at Angels Gate John Olson cited in his logbook, second assistant keeper Philip Hughes suspended from duty for assaulting the keeper. All keepers are instructed that in the future, no distilled or malt liquors are to be brought to this station. It was only 8 months after the lighthouse had begun operating. But this was on the tame end of the incidents that happened at the lighthouses. One really bad one was actually one of the stories that inspired the Lighthouse movie, but big content warning for, well, corpse talk. Skip to this time to avoid it. The Smalls Lighthouse, far off the coast of Wales, was seemingly cursed from the moment it began operation in 1776. It had structural issues right off the bat, and the lighthouse's designer Henry Whiteside and a blacksmith journeyed out to Smalls to make repairs. Months later, after bad storms, a letter in a cask that Whiteside had thrown into the sea washed up on the Welsh shore, reading, "Sir, being now in a most dangerous and distressed condition upon the Smalls, do hereby trust Providence will bring to your hand this, which prayeth for your immediate assistance to fetch us off the Smalls before the next spring, or we fear we shall all perish, our water near all gone, our fire quite gone, and our house in a most melancholy manner. I doubt not but you will fetch us from here as fast as possible. We can be got off at some part of the tide almost any weather. I need say no more, but remain your distressed humble servant, Henry Whiteside. We were distressed in a gale of wind upon the 13th of January, since which we have not been able to keep any light, but we could not have kept any light above 16 nights longer for want of oil and candles, which makes us murmur and think we are forgotten." Thankfully, Whiteside and his team survived the ordeal, but the troubles at Smalls were not over. 25 years later, Smalls gained 2 keepers, Thomas Griffith and Thomas Howell. 2 Thomases. Sound familiar? At some point it was noticed that the lighthouse had hoisted a distress signal, but sea conditions made it impossible to land on the rock. The boats that got close could see one of the keepers standing at the railing, but couldn't pick out details. Ivor Emlyn would describe what happened in a letter. Night after night saw some of them on the cliffs, watching the lights, fearful of something having befallen them both. The non-appearance of a light would have been direct proof that such was the case, but as regularly as they watched, the light burned with its unusual brightness and gave no indication of the suffering of the poor, sick, and imprisoned lightkeepers. A day or 2 before the signal was hoisted, Griffith complained of being unwell, and the means employed by his companion of affording relief proved ineffectual. Recourse was had to draw the attention of those passing the channel, who could either render assistance themselves or make the emergency known at the proper quarters. No help came. After weeks of extreme suffering, poor Griffiths breathed his last, and then, perhaps, commenced the worst chapter in the surviving Lightkeeper's experience of that sad time. Decomposition would quickly follow, and the body of death would vitilate the atmosphere of the too confined apartment. The body could not be thrown to find its grave into the sea. Suspicion with her 1,000 tongues would point at Howell as the author of foul play, that to hide a lesser fault he had committed the greater one of murder. The world is too apt to condemn errant judges. Howell's skill as a cooper enabled him to make a coffin for his dead companion out of boards obtained from the bulkhead of the dwelling apartment. After a great deal of labor, the body was carried to the platform and firmly secured to the railing. For 3 weeks, weeks apparently as long as months, it occupied this position before the weather moderated. A Milford boat at last landed 2 lightkeepers and brought away Howell and the body of his companion, but the wind not being fair for Solva, they made Milford. Howell's attenuated form demonstrated the sufferings, both mental and physical, he had undergone. His friends in some instances failed to recognize him on his return home. 4 months in such a place, and under such circumstances, what would it not affect? So for 3 long weeks, Thomas Howell was forced to live alone on that small rock, with the decomposing corpse of Thomas Griffin, who, according to some accounts, had one arm swung down past the window, making it appear that his body was waving at Howell. I think something like that would make anyone go mad. Famous situations like this are why so many people believe in haunted lighthouses. Tragedies in cold, remote towers, tragedies that weren't all that uncommon. For most keepers, the job wasn't difficult. The difficult part of it was the loneliness and the physical conditions, depending on what lighthouses you were keeping. But there were parts of the job itself that were absolutely dangerous, and one of them is one of the explanations for why so many longtime keepers seem to go mad. Mercury poisoning. Now, I know a bunch of you are already rushing to the comments to be like, what about lead poisoning? Babes, I know. We're just focusing on mercury right now because it was part of the actual job. The Fresnel lens and its extended system were extremely heavy, and it was a big issue since, obviously, the lens needs to spin around. Bernard Henri Wagner proposed the idea of floating the lanterns on a bath of mercury. A 2-ton bath of mercury. The idea didn't really take off until 1890, when it was reworked to be more efficient and with less than 2 tons of mercury, which is frankly a low bar because they ended up with only 200 pounds of mercury. But it worked. The lenses could now move with almost no friction whatsoever, and with almost no effort. At this time, people were not very aware of how toxic mercury was. In fact, mercury was regularly used as medicine. But prolonged exposure to mercury and its odorless vapor can cause a wide array of health complications in the nervous system. Memory loss, mood swings, anxiety, delirium, and confusion. After the mercury bath was implemented, there was a stark and unsettling rise in lighthouse keepers going mad. All 3 of Rottnest Island's lighthouse keepers in 1896 took their own lives, and dozens of American keepers were succumbing to alcoholism or being removed from their posts due to psychological troubles. Minot's Ledge's lighthouse keepers began to believe that the lamp was cleaning and filling itself, and the lack of corners in the structures was sending them over the edge. As late as the 1950s at Langara Point, the keeper drank methyl hydrate, disappeared into the bushes, then reappeared in the radio room naked, screaming, and swinging an axe. It wasn't just the keepers either. It was common for the keepers' wives, too, to start experiencing the symptoms of mercury poisoning. Depression from the loneliness and isolation of the job is obviously a contributing factor, but many of these cases that happen can't be explained by just depression alone. Michaela Walter wrote in Lighthouse Keeper's Madness, Folk Legend, or Something More Toxic. Logbooks describe how the lighthouse keepers would routinely lower the mercury bath, wipe dust and debris off the surface with a rag, drain the metal off, strain it through chamois leather, and top up the levels as required. In addition to the direct handling of mercury via the skin, the metal vapor would expose the lighthouse keeper to high concentrations by inhalation. Anytime the keeper was working within the area of the lens, and lighting system, exposure to mercury vapor would have occurred. And the keepers had to spend a massive amount of time up there every day, and they most certainly were not wearing protective gear. It's no wonder then that as these true stories of lighthouse keepers gone mad entered the public consciousness more and more, as these poor people continued to die and suffer because this was a time in which little to no effective care and treatment for mental illness, much less something as dire as mercury poisoning, existed, well, the common image of the lighthouse became something a bit frightening, haunted even, usually by the same souls that used to keep them alive. Lighthouse ghost stories are most often about the spirits of their former keepers or their wives for a reason. But some of those spirits are probably there for the opposite reason, because they loved life at that lighthouse so much. It wasn't always sadness. Point Firman keeper Willie Austin, before he died of his broken heart, threw a lot of boisterous parties there with his wife, and years later his daughter Thelma petitioned to become the Point Firman lighthouse keeper herself. She said, "Why, the sea in this lighthouse seemed to me like a holy shrine, and I'm afraid it would break my heart to give it up. But no matter what happens, I will accept my fate with a brave heart, and just as cheerfully as my parents would have done." When you have been raised in the lighthouse atmosphere as I have been, it is mighty difficult to change your mode of living and accept any other line of endeavor which does not offer romance and adventure. Romance and adventure is exactly what many of these keepers were looking for when they took up the job. It would be disingenuous for me to imply that lighthouses brought nothing but depression and madness. They made people extremely happy too, not the least of which were the sailors who relied on them to make it home alive. Today, the US lighthouses are fully automated and keeperless, save for the last one left with a keeper in Boston. The days in this country of romance and adventure in a lighthouse by the sea are mostly gone, but the ghosts still linger, even if only in our imaginations. Thank you so much for watching this video. Now, I want to make a very special announcement. I've literally been sitting on this news for over a year. You probably know by now that I am a cartoonist. I make comics. Well, I'd like to announce my upcoming graphic novel coming in 2023 from Getty Publications, a graphic novel biography of the artist Claude Cahun. Claude Cahun, born on October 25th, 1894, was a gay, genderqueer Jewish artist from Nantes, France, who created some amazing surrealist photography with their life partner and fellow artist Marcel Moore. The two of them were also anti-Nazi resistance fighters on the island of Jersey during World War II, and it is such an exciting story. It's been such an amazing and fascinating journey the last year working with the Getty to bring this book to life, and I really hope you'll stick around and keep an eye out for when it's published in 2023. I really think you'll like it, so watch this space. Don't forget to click the link in the description below or the pinned comment to get a 3-year subscription for just $1.39 per month with a 30-day money-back guarantee. Hop on that soon because it won't last. On that note, wash thy hands, wear thy mask, and let me know in the comments if you live near any haunted lighthouses. I'd really love to hear about it.